easy first question. What brought you to the study of mushrooms?
What brought me to the study of mushrooms? Well, first my first memories are when my parents told me not to step on puffballs because the spores would make my twin brother blind. Telling a 5-year-old son that gave me ready ammunition to pelt my twin brother with puffballs at every opportunity. We both suffer from bad eyesight. It's not related to puffballs, but when parents tell children that something's forbidden, then it increases the mystery. And because I was mischievous and interested and spent a lot of times in the woods and outside, putting that information to good use was very appropriate for my brother and I. Secondarily, I really became impassioned about mushrooms because I have a stuttering habit. And I went through 6 or 7 years of speech therapy, and I literally could not speak a single sentence in a minute. My stammering habit was just incredibly profound. And as advice to people who are around stutterers, don't finish their sentences. Oftentimes stutterers, they're thinking many sentences downstream. And so when I was about 17 or 18 years of age, I took a massive dose of psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, and I was by myself, and there was a storm approaching, and I climbed up this large tree during this wind and lightning storm, and it was a terrifying experience because I had never done mushrooms before. And I was up in this tree in 40, 50-mile-an-hour winds and rain and lightning cackling all over around me. And I was terrified. I was literally, the tree was going back 4 or 5 feet back and forth in the wind, and there's lots of lightning strikes all around me. I was really scared. But I thought, since I'm up there and I can't get down, it wasn't safe, what am I going to do? And I thought to myself, I should really focus on that which I have the biggest problem personally, and that was my inability to communicate. And so even though 6 or 7 years of speech therapy gave me no advantage. Actually, they wanted to put me in a special education class, which was devastating to my ego. And so during this mushroom experience, I thought to myself, why don't I just stop stuttering now? And that became my mantra for about 4 or 5 hours. And the storm passed, and I kept on repeating that to myself. And I came down out of the tree, and the next day I stopped stuttering. So that was my empowerment, and I realized that mushrooms were my sort of what nature has given me to empower my ability to communicate. I still do stutter occasionally, but it's nothing like it was before, which was a major handicap that I had.
That's an incredible story. So our next question is the one you've prepared for, which is what are mushrooms? Because when I read your book, it became very apparent to me that I really didn't know what a mushroom was. How do they grow, and what constitutes the organism, and how does it work?
Well, this is an example of a subject that the more you study it, the more you realize there is to know and that you did not know. And science is rapidly evolving in its understanding. The Earth is going through its 6th major extinction. This is the 6th great extinction that's been identified thus far. And I'd like to talk about 2 of the prior extinctions. We're in the middle of the 6th extinction. We are probably the people or the organisms that are responsible for it, the forces that are causing it. 465 million years ago, we shared a common ancestry with fungi. Basically, life hit the beach from the ocean. Land masses had virtually no life whatsoever. Our fungal ancestors came to the beach, and then there was a divergence. We actually are mushroom people. We came from fungi. Fungi are our ancestors. Our fungal ancestors that went overland in order to protect the cells from dehydration and exposure to sunlight became multicellular. And then our animal ancestors, or the lineage that gave rise to animals, encapsulated its nutrients by encircling food with a cellular sac, basically a stomach, and produces enzymes and acids that would digest the food. The fungi became filamentous and produced these long linear chains that look like cobwebs. They're only 1 cell wall thick, but they're linear and they diverge and they form this matrix of cells. And they went underground. And so 465 million years ago, as life evolved on land, then there's a tremendous species diversification. 250 million years ago, at the boundary of the Permian and the Triassic period, a giant asteroid or a comet Some people postulate there are volcanoes that blew up in Siberia. The two may be related. We don't know. But we do know the entire Earth was shrouded in a layer of dust. And this can be seen in the geologic record. That was the third mass extinction of species on the planet, and the most significant. Over 90% of the species on the planet became extinct at the border of the Permian and the Triassic periods. When the meteor or comet or asteroid hit the Earth, then the massive explosion occurred and the Earth became shrouded in dust. Virtually all sunlight was cut off. We don't know if it was for months or for years or for decades. But in any event, because there was no light that was reaching to the ground, there was a massive die-off of plants. And the fungi, of course, require no light. The plants that associated with fungi were able to get sugars and nutrients with the fungi, so there's a natural selective pressure from that catastrophic event for symbiosis between fungi and plants. Then we march forward after the skies cleared. Then there's more speciation, plants were reborn, symbioses were rewarded, and we marched forward into a very diverse species landscape. Until 65 million years ago, as most people know, we had another impact, another catastrophic event, which caused another massive extinction. And again, fungi inherited the Earth. The Earth was shrouded in darkness and dust. And then from these fungal fragments and these microbial communities and plant communities, after the 65 million years ago, from that impact, the largest animals that survived were small voles, which are very mycophilic. They actually consume fungi as a food source. Fungi respire carbon dioxide and inhale oxygen just like we do. We have a more common ancestry with fungi than we do with any other kingdom. As speciation then occurred, as the life systems were reborn, then the species diversity of fungi just blossomed. To date, we know there's 1 to 2 million species of fungi in the world, in the kingdom. About 10% are mushrooms. These are producing the visible fleshy fungi, which most people are familiar with. We know about 10% of the kingdom are mushrooms, about 150,000 species. We've only identified 14,000 species to date, which means our ignorance exceeds our knowledge by at least one order of magnitude. In the recent article in the Journal of Eukaryotic Biology, 27 eukaryotic evolutionary biologists have created a new map, basically, of the kingdoms. And they've erected a new super kingdom, and fungi and animals are in the same kingdom. And the kingdom is called Opisthokonta. And Opisthokonta is the super kingdom that unifies animals and fungi, because animals literally came from fungi. These vast and cellular networks are massive. The largest organism in the world now has been identified as a mycelial mat. This is the fine cobwebby-like filaments that you see. Just go to any piece of wood on the ground and kick it over. You can see it everywhere. And the largest organism is in eastern Oregon. It's 2,200 acres in size, over 2,400 years old. It has climaxed the forest many times over. 10, 15,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, as the glaciers receded, this scraped off the soil and flushed it into the ocean as the glaciers melted. Anyone who's been around glaciers, you know there's lots of moraine beds and there's gravel bars and there's basically rock without soil. Small lenses survived, and these small lenses became islands of biodiversity, and the plant communities would grow up and they would climax, and the fungi would rot them, and then soil would be created. Fungi are the grand molecular disassemblers in nature. They're the interface organisms between life and death. They generate soil. As these lenses of soil expanded, then they had a greater carrying capacity for more biodiversity, and more species proliferated. And then they would climax, the plants and animals. They would die. Fungi would recycle them. More soil would be produced. The soil would get thicker. The lens would become larger. Indeed, the entire food web of nature is based on these fungal filaments. The mycelial network that infuses all land masses in the world is a supportive membrane upon which life proliferates and further diversifies. I've often thought that if there was a united organization of organisms, otherwise known as and every organism had a vote, would we be voted off the planet? And I think there is a chorus of voices from the microbial world And from the natural world, that is voting right now. And the rule of nature is that when a species exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment, diseases proliferate. Populations that have become too large, that climax and famine, disease, maybe war occur in order to knock down the population back to a level where the environment can carry that population without devastating the underlying biological community. We are here today because of a series of evolutionary successes, but that doesn't mean that we're going to be here tomorrow. And if you look in the crystal ball of this planet, we may well have the future that looks like Mars. And that as the ecosystems collapse because of our disrespect and not being a responsible citizen in this biological community on this planet, then the ecosystem can unravel. What we don't know is at what point when we lose biodiversity, that the system will start to fall apart. Now, I believe in the resilience of nature, so I think that once the human species becomes extinct, and many species have become extinct before us, many species will become extinct after us, that the Earth may well spin on its axis happily without humans, and the microbes and the insects will inherit the world, unless we cause such a dramatic climate shift that we become an arid, cold planet like Mars. If you look at the number of stars in our galaxy, and mathematicians have already postulated this, and it's a mathematical proof at this point, there'll be hundreds of planets the size of Earth at a distance equal to our Earth's distance to our sun. There'll be hundreds of planets the size of Earth of a similar distance to a star like our sun, which means that liquid water is likely to occur. I have no doubt that life is proliferated throughout the universe, and that our time now may be recorded in the history of the universe as a small footnote of an evolutionary experiment that's gone awry.
That was good.
That started with what are mushrooms?
Okay. Well, did you know that you came from fungus?
I had no
I
idea.
did not yet.
No, I hope I don't have to repeat that because I don't think I could. Okay. Okay.
And then,
Now, can I put on my hat without interfering with the light?
let's see.
Do you want the
That's a mushroom hat here.
There are many things about mushrooms that are fascinating. One of the things that I found to be really fascinating is that mushrooms can make hats. And this is a hat that is made from this mushroom. This mushroom, the Latin name is called Fomes fomentarius. It is a tinder mushroom. This mushroom is literally why the migration from Africa, and there's no doubt that we all originated in Africa. We are all Africans. And as we migrated into Europe, we discovered something new called winter. And if your clan could not have fire available, the clan would die out, obviously. So the firekeeper, even today, in many tribes, is a very revered and important position. Well, this mushroom allowed for the portability of fire. And you can hollow this mushroom out, put embers of a fire or coals in it, and then you can carry fire literally for days. And you can blow into this after you uncork it and rekindle it. Well, our ancestors found that this mushroom, and I think it's true with many plants, and when they have a multiplicity of useful attributes, then they become shamanistically important, not just because of one. This mushroom has very strong antimicrobial properties. When you boil this mushroom and you pound it, then it separates into fibers. Yeah. So this hat came from this mushroom. And this mushroom is called Fomes fomentarius. And our ancestors realized that when you boil this mushroom, it gives an antimicrobial or a preservative effect to foods, especially in soups, if there's meats involved, etc. If you pound this mushroom after it's been boiled in water, it separates into a fabric. And actually, this fabric is mycelium. And so the mycelium generates a mushroom, the mushroom grows into mycelium. It's just a revolving sort of circle. Our ancestors, having the portability of fire, allowed us to be migrated into Europe. And of course, as winter set in, we tried to find caves. Well, unfortunately, cave bears were there for millions of years. And so, caves became a sort of battleground between humans and cave bears. The cave bears, being effective predators, in order to fight the cave bears and get them out of the caves, then communities had to develop and sort of preventing the bears from either entering the cave or keeping the bears or getting the bears out of the caves. So this mushroom is one example of many that has been instrumental to the survival of humans as we've migrated across the land masses. 10,000 years ago, we were forest people. We had intimate contact with nature. Today, we're in cars, we're in freeways, we're in buildings that are artificial. And way back when, we had an intimate knowledge of nature, and I dare say that even though our scientific knowledge, quote unquote, is more advanced, in many ways, we've lost a lot of the ancestral knowledge that was instrumental to our very survival. When you consider the size of the mycelium, and these mushrooms, this is called a wood conch, and they grow on trees. They're called shelf fungi or hoof fungi. They're really hard. They're hard like wood, and so they're not easily digestible. But because of their usefulness in carrying fire, and it was found when you boil these mushrooms, you would preserve food. And of course, souring food meant you would have to go out and hunt more and gather more, so having food that would be preserved was really important. There are other wood conch mushrooms that are equally as fascinating. And this is one that I'm particularly excited about. It's called a garricon. The Latin name is Fomitopsis officinalis. 2,000 years ago, Dioscorides first described it in the very first Materia Medica as a treatment against consumption, later to be known as tuberculosis. It was associated primarily with women and women herbalists. And this mushroom is now thought to be extinct in Europe, or nearly extinct. It's illegal to pick it in most countries. It is exclusive to the old-growth forests. And since Europe doesn't have very few old-growth forests now, or if any, this is why it's not there. We still have it in Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and in British Columbia. 2.5 years ago, in response to the BioShield program, the U.S. Defense Department, we started sending in our strains of mushrooms. We have over 250 strains in culture. We submitted over 150 strains for analysis in the BioShield program, specifically to see if there is activity against viruses, in particular smallpox. The single most threat that the U.S. Defense Department has identified is bioterrorism. As bad as it sounds, if a nuclear weapon exploded in Boston, it would not shut down airplane travel between Seattle and Los Angeles. A bioterrorist attack would. And we began to receive research results, and lo and behold, this mushroom has been found by the BioShield program, the U.S. Defense Department, or our cultures of it, to be highly effective against pox viruses. Cowpox, vaccinia, and the word vaccine comes from vaccinia, because milk maidens, it was discovered in Europe, when smallpox was sweeping through Europe, the milk maidens who were exposed to cows would get cowpox, these little sort of black blisters on their hands, but they were immune, it was found out, from smallpox. And so that knowledge was observed, was carried forth, and one good physician made the observation, and I'm sure the ladies did too. And so they found that if they take the cowpox scabs, they could actually confer an immunity against smallpox. Now, we must not forget the U.S. government and the British government were actively involved in bioterrorism against indigenous peoples. And Native Americans in the Northwest and in North America in general have no history of raising cattle. So they had no exposure to cowpox. So those of us from European backgrounds, if there was a smallpox epidemic, 30% of us would die, 30% of us would become blind, 30% of us would be horribly maimed and scarred, and 10% of us would survive without any effect. With Native Americans, over 90% of them would die. And so as the militarization of the West Coast occurred, and the Brits and the United States were in competition, but they both held in common the secret biological weapon, oftentimes carried with blankets, and unfortunately at the time of signing of treaties. They realized that this warrior elite of Native Americans, they were oftentimes positioned at military strategic ports of entrance where rivers would flow into the ocean. That's where the settlements were. That's where the salmon was coming. That's where the bears would come down. It was lowlands, and so the winters were not as severe. It was rich in all sorts of food. Well, the military realized, the U.S. and British governments, that they would lose a lot of their soldiers if they fought the Indians in hand-to-hand combat. The Indians were experts at guerrilla warfare. They lived and grew up in the old-growth forest. They knew how to use the old-growth forest, whereas the Brits and the Americans did not. So they found that if they sent in smallpox-contaminated blankets or individuals into these communities, in a year's time, they could walk into the villages and not have to fight. A good friend of mine is Gu Zhao, who's the president of the Haida people, of the Haida Gwaii, formerly known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. The Haida Gwaii and the Haida people don't like to call it the Queen Charlotte Islands because that was the name of the ship that brought in the smallpox. Gu Zhao people also revered this mushroom. Again, it was associated primarily, not exclusively, but with women shamans. And grave guardians would be carved from this mushroom and placed on on the shamans' graves. And that would help them carry into the afterlife to fight evil spirits. And so Gu Zhao's people did not know that this mushroom was active against smallpox. And he told me if they did, they would have lost 50,000. Their population of the Haida Gwaii Islands would not have gone from 50,000 to less than 500 in 3 years. As it turns out, when we boil this mushroom, much in the same way that we boil this mushroom, the anti-pox properties are lost. But when we take a piece of tissue from the mushroom and we grow it in a petri dish and using a specialized technique, the anti-pox properties are preserved. We have now tested this against a number of other viruses. And now we have found that this mushroom is active against at least 6 viruses, 3 pox viruses and 3 other viruses that many people are aware of. And so I believe this is one example where nature has within it remedies heretofore undiscovered. That even the 2,000 years of use by humans, we are still discovering new things about things that we already thought that we knew all about. And I believe that we should save the old-growth forest as a matter of national defense. It's a unifying argument. And when I presented this to some conservative friends, and my family is very conservative, they cheer. They go, oh my gosh, this makes perfect sense. Osama bin Laden does not have an old-growth forest, but we do. And now we're down to less than 4% of the original old-growth forest, and this species is at the brink of extinction. It's so important that we get this in the culture and we preserve the genome, because if we lose the biodiversity within this species, we may be losing the very strains that are essential for protecting millions of humans. To put it in perspective, in 1942, a lady in Peoria, Illinois, a housewife, sent in a moldy cantaloupe to a U.S. Defense Department Army hospital. Upon the request of the U.S. government to Americans to send in your moldy fruit, an odd request, I admit. But her moldy cantaloupe gave rise to the strain of fungus that produced the most potent form of penicillin heretofore seen. Penicillium chrysogenum strains, which were already known, could not be industrialized. But her moldy cantaloupe strain gave rise to a strain that was 200 times more potent than anything they've seen, and allowed the U.S. and the British to produce penicillin as an antibiotic for treating battlefield wounds. The Germans and the Japanese did not have penicillin. The Americans and British did. One class of battlefield wounds, 90% of the soldiers would die from infection. After the introduction of penicillin, 90% of them would survive. A huge influence, and it speaks to the importance of biodiversity. Now, this mushroom does not enjoy the widespread plasticity of the distribution of a cantaloupe. It is limited in the old-growth forest. What else is out there? And I think this is the tip of the iceberg, and speaks to the importance of biodiversity, and that these fungi have evolved for billions of years now, and being in direct molecular communication with this environment and producing antibiotics and strategies of survival that we can, for lack of a better word, capitalize upon. So I mentioned that this mushroom is not active directly against viruses, but the mycelium is. And the mycelium is only one cell wall thick, and it forms these fibrous membranes like cobwebs, and they're all around you all the time. And a single cubic inch of soil, there's more than 8 miles of these cells. Every time you take a step in a woodlands, you're stepping on 300 miles of mycelium. It's everywhere. And it's decomposing wood, and as it decomposes the wood, it liberates gases and forms microcavities where all these other organisms live. And these microcavities become wells for storing water. And so when the mycelium infuses through a substrate, it has the ability of holding water longer, which of course benefits all the other organisms in the biological community, prevents erosion. So what's so amazing is that after hundreds of millions of years of evolution, we are multicellular. I have 6 skin layers before you get to the inside, approximately. The mycelium has 1. And yet on the very opposite side of that cell wall are hundreds of millions of microbes trying to eat it. How does the mycelium, with 1 skin layer, prevent these microbes from eating it, and yet the mycelium achieves the largest mass of any organism in the world? How does it do that? It's because it's a very sophisticated and yet unknown properties of this membrane that's in constant biomolecular communication with the outside environment, developing strategies and producing antibiotics, antiviral compounds, antiprotozoal compounds, preventing microbial parasites from ingesting it. At the same time, it creates this mantle, this fabric, this mycelial matrix that becomes the foundation of the food web. So the mycelium, as it's producing these antibiotics, we can benefit from them. It is well known that if you get a fungal infection, the antifungal antibiotics that we have at our disposal tend to be toxic to you. And the reason why they're toxic to you is you have a more common ancestry with fungi than you do with other organisms like bacteria. We have very excellent antibacterial antibiotics coming from fungi that are not harmful to us because of that same relationship. We share the more common ancestry with fungi. So how does this work in the environment then? This means that you can project mycelial membranes and customize them to the microbial contaminants that are maybe present in the environment. Whether it is a West Nile virus or malaria being transported by insects but thriving in swamplands, you can create mycelial membranes that become microfiltration filters that then are exuding these natural antibiotics, keeping the populations of these viruses and bacteria in check. And so I espouse, or I'm a voice for the concept of microfiltration and using mycelial membranes in the environment in order to influence downstream health of habitats by mitigating these disease vectors. Now it goes much further than that, because the mycelium produces enzymes and acids that break down plant cell walls. And these plant cell walls are held together by carbon-hydrogen bonds. Well, the exudates from the mycelium, the sweat that it produces, these digestive enzymes, also break down hydrocarbons. And so my work and my experimentation and that of other people around the world have confirmed that the mycelium from these mushrooms can break down diesel, pesticides, PCBs, dioxins. And what's unique about mushroom mycelium, that's very different than mold mycelium, is mushroom mycelium is primarily forest fungi, forest mushrooms. They become vast in size. Mold mycelium tends to be very small. The colonies being epicentered on an insect, for instance, the locality of evolution is relatively small. Forests are thousands of acres, and so fungi that produce mushrooms grow to thousands of acres in size. This gives us a ready ability to tap into this powerful inherent resource that mushroom mycelium has to remediate environments, prevent downstream pollution from microbes, from viruses, including bacteria, protozoa, and also for breaking down a wide assortment of pollutants. And this is one of the pedestals of myco-restoration, using mushroom mycelium in order to heal environments, because these are truly healing membranes. And we walk upon these membranes daily, but their structure and the ability of these membranes to survive is largely unexplored. We do know symbiosis is absolutely critical, and these fungi that grow in these environments have all sorts of other microbial, plant, and animal allies that hold this whole fabric together. And again, we don't know what happens if we lose some of these citizens in this biological community before the whole system unravels.
I have a question off of this. This is great. Does the mycelium run under, let's say, asphalt? Like, does it?
Yeah.
If there's a mat, let's say here in this house, in this backyard, is it running under all these houses and maybe crossing the street underneath in the ground? Is it health? It can't do that. It can't survive these kinds of urban zones, or is it only in the forest?
There's much more fungal diversity in ecosystems which have a lot more plant debris. So if you go to desert ecosystems versus a northwest old-growth forest, there's a lot more fungal mycelium in the duff of the old-growth forest than there is in the sand in a desert. But the mycelium has an amazing ability in that it can be running diffusely, and it's a water transport mechanism that can move water over great distances. So there can be single threads of mycelium that can channel hundreds of gallons of water over hundreds of feet. And so mycelium does grow under roads, and there's great examples of shaggy mane mushrooms breaking asphalt. And several highways in the United States have had to be rebuilt because shaggy mane mushrooms, which you can crush in your hand, but because of a helical explosion in this polysaccharide matrix as the mushroom forms, it explodes over 4 or 5 days, and in doing so produces so much force it'll crack asphalt and concrete. This is just one of the many examples. We move very quickly. Plants don't seem to grow that quickly, but mycelium is somewhere in between. Mycelium is moving anywhere from 1 to 4 inches per day. It can be less than that, it can be more than that. But these are mycelial mats that are projecting all the time, infusing landscapes. And as a result, there is this merging and throughputting of mycelial mats going in between each other. And there's alliances and associations. After the great asteroid or comet strikes, the fungi that paired up with plants, many of those became mycorrhizal fungi. And the mycorrhizal fungi, and indeed now you cannot define any plant without its fungal associates. Plants do not exist on this planet alone. Plants are always in association with fungi. Endophytic fungi that infuse through the stems and the leaves that prevent insects from parasitizing them. Mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with the root zones that extend the root zones by more than 100-fold in many cases. And also gives a host defense to the plant, preventing parasites, fungal parasites, bacterial, insects, etc. And as a result, by capillary action, and it's basically an extended root system, it brings in a lot more nutrients. The parasitic fungi, thought to be the bane of foresters. Well, indeed, it climaxes forests that don't have good host defense systems. And what does it do? It builds more soil for the next generation. And through this learning process of natural selection, the plants, in a sense, develop a smarter methods of being able to prevent parasites. And so parasitic fungi, once thought to be bad diseases of the forest, now by the most advanced ecoforesters and forestry scientists are looked upon a larger picture as being the part of the natural cycle of bringing ecosystems back into equilibrium.
Can you talk about how mushrooms can eat VX gas as one of VX chemical, sarin, and how we can use mushrooms to get rid of chemical weapons?
Okay. I was involved with Battelle Laboratories for 5 or 6 years, and they surveyed my strains for their effects against a wide variety of toxins. I did not know it at the time, but they were also contracted by the Defense Department, and they challenged, as they call it, my strains against a number of toxins, including nerve toxins. One is called DMMP, dimethylmethylphosphonate, which is the core constituent in VX and soman and sarin. And VX is a potent neurotoxin, as soman and sarin is. And Saddam Hussein did use it and killed over 20,000 Kurds in a matter of 3 days through aerial bombardment of this very potent nerve toxin. One of the strains, again from the old-growth forest, dephosphorylated VX in a heretofore unprecedented fashion. This got a lot of attention. It was published in Jane's Defense Weekly. A number of internal papers were also produced. It actually became kind of sort of black box. But the fungi produced a unique enzymatic system, this one strain that I had, heretofore unseen, in the degradation of a toxin that otherwise was very recalcitrant and that could not be broken down. Once these fungi unravel these big molecular complexes into their subunits, then all sorts of other organisms and other sorts of enzymatic systems can come into play to further break them down. So they're otherwise very, very resistant to rot or decomposition. Same thing. And what the fungi do is begin to break those essential molecular bonds, especially phosphorus bonds, in this case with VX. And by doing so, the rest of the VX molecule begins to disintegrate. Mushrooms also have a very bizarre property of hyperaccumulating heavy metals. This came up after Chernobyl. When the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred, and a spew of radioactive gas and fallout covered a large swath of Western Europe. Geiger counters went off all over Europe, and the Ukrainians were immediately identified as having a nuclear disaster. Because the Ukrainians and Europeans are avid mushroom hunters, the question became, are these mushrooms safe to eat? Very valid question. So analysis were done in soil samples, and then mushrooms were analyzed. And lo and behold, what was discovered was something that was totally unexpected. There are some mushrooms that hyperaccumulate cesium-137 over 10,000 times the background contamination in the ecosystem. This is a phenomenal concentration from far away of these heavy metal radioactive isotopes, which are toxic to almost all forms of life. And they'll concentrate them via the mycelium, which is everywhere. So when you find a mushroom that could be sorted by a mycelial mat that's acres in size, the mushroom is just the tip of the iceberg. The radioactive seed, in this case, cesium-137, with a mushroom called the Hideous Gomphidus glutinosus, actually the mushroom becomes radioactive. And it detoxifies the ecosystem. Now, why would nature design something like that? And this, I think, is the real point, is these fungal systems have a long-term view of population, sustainability, and health. And they want the community of the forest to survive, so more trees can be produced, more debris trails, more Gomphidus glutinosus can grow. By detoxifying the ecosystem so the other plant communities and animals can survive is in its own best interest. And I think this is a model of how we should behave. What I hear in my dreams is generations in the future screaming back to us in time, saying, what are you doing? Don't you see? We are at this critical point in time, and we've evolved to be the leaders of our biological community, and we are misleading. We are causing the devastation to our very foundation of our life system that has given us birth, and we are ultimately committing suicide. One spectacular and unfortunate example. My wife Dusty and I went to China, to Shanghai, last March, and I was in China in 1984. This is last March is over 20 years later, and I came back with immediately the impression and the concept that China is committing ecological suicide. Shanghai is incredibly anemic biologically. Now the sudden interest in owning automobiles personally, and the amount of pollution and air pollution there is just out of control. So I would like you to read something that an ecologist wrote me just recently after seeing my book. And he wrote me something that I think really puts this into focus. So I'd like to read it just for a second. This is very, very potent. And I just, shivers went up and down my spine when this person wrote this to me.
So this one nuclear mushroom, basically. So out of this whole mycophyllal map, there's basically one mushroom that's
no. There's hundreds of them that we know.
But in this
there's one particular, yes.
There's like in a small area, maybe a couple of mushrooms that are basically highly nuclear reactive, and they're just sitting there. They're just growing.
Okay,
that's incredible. Do you have a picture of that? Maybe?
Yeah, I have photographs of it, not glowing in the dark. But the idea would be. Why would that be advantageous? Another thing, well, a deer could come along, pick up the mushroom, go 4 or 5 miles away, and poop it out.
Exactly.
The environment's been detoxified to a large degree. Now you repeat that over generations and generations of ecosystems maturing and climaxing, and then what happens eventually is that the environment is detoxified. So I think these fungi take a long-term view. This email comes to me from an ecological habitat restorator employed by an international agency and received an award actually in habitat design. And he is over there trying to develop ecological parks. Asian culture is in love with nature. And unfortunately, capitalism in China and elsewhere in the world has now trespassed upon natural systems to the point that is having a devastating effect. And so here's what he wrote. This is around Shanghai, is where he's located. Despite China's wonderful soil profile from glaciation and alluvial deposits, the central and eastern regions of the country appear to be devoid of fungi, devoid of worms in the soil, devoid of frogs in the creeks, and insects in the air. Only in the steep mountainous wilderness areas where it is too steep to farm, you will find such biodiversity. Let's amplify this over the entire planet. Let's take Shanghai, it could be New Jersey. This is a growing disease that's expanding over the surface mass of the planet. If you put a glass bubble over Shanghai, would it be sustainable? No. It's not outputting enough nutrients and oxygen. It's not sustainable. It's been artificially supported. This, unfortunately, humans are literally becoming a disease blight on the ecosystem of the planet. Unless we rein in and start looking downstream, you have a responsibility for your grandchildren's future. Are you being responsible with the heritage that you're supposed to pass downstream? Or are you taking it all for yourself in your lifetime because you think Armageddon's going to come and it doesn't matter anyhow?
So why don't we talk about, right now I have a couple of questions, but why don't we talk about how worried are you? I mean, where are we in sort of this trajectory of the way we do business here on this planet, and how concerned are you with what may happen to us and the planet?
You know, paranoia is a good thing when to help guide you when you don't know of the threats that are around you and you can't discern exactly what they are. But I think we have a very clear understanding now that there's a tremendous loss of biodiversity. And the loss of species in our biological community is the foundation of the food web that will begin to unravel and is unraveling. How concerned, and I have two different, I'm sort of schizophrenic on this. I have two different attitudes. Well, what the heck? The human species has had its time in history. It'll be a footnote, you know, in the Galactic Encyclopedia, and the human species didn't get its act together, so it became extinct. Onward and upwards with other communities that would become smarter over time. That's kind of the big view. The short view is I have a grandson. I want to make sure that he grows up in a healthy and happy life. And I think we have a responsibility for future generations. The loss of biodiversity is something that we can't even estimate. And the difficulty that we face now is any estimations that we have are probably totally inadequate to the problems that we cannot yet see. And that's what I fear. And I'm not going to be an alarmist, but you take the example of Shanghai and you see it spreading. You take the example of anywhere in the industrialized world. And as the deforestation, hey folks, we're getting rid of the oxygen producers on the planet by cutting down the forests, and you need oxygen. So I often thought maybe in the future there'll be an export tax. I live in Washington State. Washington State should be charging Arizona for its oxygen, because oxygen is not being produced in Arizona. It's overpopulated. It's exceeded the carrying capacity of its environment. Now, obviously, that's I'm not being serious, but there is this balance in checks, and there is a spreadsheet, and we are on the debit side a lot more than on the credit side. And as the ecosystems do become more imbalanced, then there's going to be a catastrophic loss of species. And this is what many ecologists, not just myself, but a voice of people highly concerned, highly skilled, very knowledgeable in their specialties, are all being unified in their expression of concern.
How long do you think we have, and what do we need to do to turn this around?
How long do we have before we have catastrophic failure? Since shamans have already stated they think it's too late. I'm not going to go there. I think with the power of mycelium and understand how these fungal networks work, they move very quickly. They respond very quickly to catastrophia. They've been designed by nature to do so. So I think they can repair these ecosystems very, very quickly, provided the world gets involved. And, I don't want to harp on my own book, but I wrote this book, Mycelium Running, How Mushrooms Can Help Save the World. It is a manual for the mycological rescue of the planet. It is how to engage fungal systems to heal ecosystems from pollutants. And it is my most significant work, and I hope it'll open up doors for generations downstream. How much longer do we have? Depends on the ecosystem. China is trying to replant trees. Well, I praise that. I think that's a wonderful thing. And to the extent that they can replant trees versus the devastation that is growing, I don't think it's even a drop in the ocean in terms of what's needed to be done. The ecosystems are fragile in many areas of the world and may have been devastated beyond immediate repair. I think ultimately, over hundreds of years, the ecosystems can be repaired. But the only way that we can save this planet or save ourselves from extinction, and I think we'll go extinct before the planet will, is to get communities of individuals together. And we need to empower environmental scientists, empower biologists. Environmental sciences should be taught at kindergarten from the very beginning, and students need to be taught from the very beginning that every action, every footprint they make on this planet has an effect on nature. And without that knowledge, I don't have much hope for the human species. I do have the hope of the fact that nature will rebel and then exclude us as a member of the biological community if necessary, if we don't get our act together.
Why do you think we are committing a suicide? What is it about a human that prevents us as a general collective from acting sustainably in our environment? What do you think are the prime motivators that can help us conduct our behavior this way?
I have to be careful because my mother is a charismatic Christian and she's a Christian leader.
Just do it.
So,
Your mother's not right.
no, she's not, but she'll watch this, I'm sure. So, hi, Mom.
She'll be supportive.
She'll be supportive. I think we have we were forest people, and we worshipped in the woods, and we relished and celebrated nature. We all have a sense of our own mortality, and the idea of an afterlife is something that most cultures share in common. So with the rise of monotheism, the belief in one God and other gods are evil, and this materialistic system of churches requiring the parishioners to give money to the church so the church can build bigger buildings and bigger, congregations, and then the politicization of the religious movement by the right is really causing us a lot of harm. We need to celebrate our diversity in religious beliefs, our diversity in biological systems. My mother's a charismatic Christian, and I love her dearly, and she's a good woman. And I think everybody on this planet, I would say 98% of the people on this planet, believe in the virtue of what is good. What, is, we want things that make us happier and healthier. We want our children to be happier and healthier. I think that's almost a universal. But putting those into practice is, I think, where we fail. And I had this epiphany, and this whole thing about the teaching evolution in the school, and whether evolution or intelligent design should be taught as on equal footings. And I had this epiphany, well, it makes perfect sense. Evolution is God's intelligent design. There's two things that we can accept. I think most religions will accept. We are incapable of comprehending the enormity of the concept of God. Whatever it is, we know that we're incomplete, and we can't even imagine the enormity of the concept. And two, we have evolved and were born from nature. And if we claim that we are intelligent, how could nature not be intelligent? And yet, if we acknowledge that our intelligence is inadequate to the concept of God, then we are still children in the ecosystem, and we should be extremely careful, because as we move forward in time and with our technologies, we are truly Neanderthals with nuclear weapons. We better step back, take a breath, look around, and consult with our microbial allies. We have to come into alliance with the microbes that have given us life.
Can you go into the spirit, the forest people, and the mushrooms that we ate to expand our...
Yeah, see, now we're starting to trespass into some private stuff that I'm not sure if I really want to go too far.
Okay, you don't...
I mean, I could talk about things that'll really, really, really blow your mind. Okay.
How about, would you want to talk about the practice of ingesting mushrooms to connect to a wider perception through shamanic ritual? Yeah.
I wrote the book on this, but see, my sensitivity right now is, we have ceremony and ritual for helping us understand, religious concepts. And Native peoples, in particular, my limited familiarity with Native Americans I would use that model and expand upon their knowledge base. One of the best things that I've ever heard from the Native American community is the concept of 7 generations. If we could, they should get the Nobel Prize for Communication if there was such a one, because this is something that I think that we all need to pay attention to. I hear nature screaming out to me, saying, "Wake up, don't you see? We are your allies, we are your friends, but you have been given a position of honor which is being abused." And I sense that we have become deafened to the voices of nature because of our technology, the immediacy of personal gratification, because of the fog of politics and war and the media. And that it's time for us to go back to nature. How many people, how many Americans have spent a night in an old-growth forest? And then policies being dictated by people who've never spent a night in the old-growth forest? You're supposed to be experts on the subjects that you make decisions about. And if you aren't experts, your decisions are obviously inadequate to the task. I sense that the environment in which that has given us birth, so many of us need to go back, to experience that which our ancestors were very much a part of. And the disconnect that we have now is that we're speeding, into obliviously into our own demise. Mushrooms have engaged us as vectors for transport. We transport spores. Every time that we shake hands, every time that we get in an automobile, every time we mail a letter, we're sending spore mass, over great distances. Mushrooms realize that insects, which are animals, and animals are good ways of carrying spores to different locations. The spores are like dust or like pollen, they can go over great distances. But oftentimes 2 spores have to come together before there's a mating, before there's a successful mushroom colony remote from the source of the parent mushroom. Well, something that I discovered and other people discovered as well, which is fabulously interesting and fun that anyone can do, is if you go into the woods and you find a mushroom that you like, and obviously don't ever eat a mushroom without an expert identifying it, that goes without saying, I think. But if you find a mushroom that you really want to cultivate, I found that when you pick the mushroom up, at the base of the stem are all these roots. And it's a miraculous property of these mushrooms that if you cut the stems, the stem base, the bottom of the mushroom, which everyone does before they eat them, they throw the stem base away. Well, guess what? The stem base regrows into mycelium. And so I thought, well, how is this? This is very interesting. It's like a proximity method for spreading the colony, not using spores. Well, then I thought, deer and bear and all sorts of other animals, raccoons and squirrels and voles, lots of animals eat mushrooms. Let's take the deer example. The deer come along, they see a mushroom. They love mushrooms. They bite the mushroom. They pull it up and they chomp on it, but they won't eat the dirt. What do? The base of the stem drops off as they walk away, falls into the ground, and it resprouts. And so stem butt inoculation methods, which is what we call them, is taking the butts at the base of the stem is an excellent way of propagating mushrooms and allowing you to carry natural spawn from the woods and plant it in your backyard. Okay? And the book's full of that. The book has all the visuals.
And last, I guess, is why don't we end with you giving us a vision for how we should live?
Okay.
Create a vision. Yep. Create a vision which would, instead of being angry, would be elated.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Okay.
For us, and then we can close.
Okay. What I see as the solution, and I'm speaking from a mycocentric point of view. Obviously, I'm specialized in fungi, but from what I know thus far, with my limited knowledge, is I really believe that mushroom farms should be reinvented as healing arts centers for the communities. They are recycling all sorts of waste material. They're producing a medicinal or a food product that has great properties. But the enzymes that are present inside the straw and the sawdust and the other material they use, the compost, those enzymes are extremely powerful for breaking down toxic waste. We need to harvest those enzymes and those substrates that are fully myceliated with different species and then replant them in the outside ecosystems surrounding communities that need attention, that need to be healed. And by then integrating mushroom farms and cultivation facilities, and this is just from micro cultivation facilities of a home grower in their backyard, you can customize and orchestrate mycological communities, communities of mushrooms that are specific to the needs of your family, of your community, of the ecosystem, whether the issues are health-related, cancer, antivirals, antimicrobials, or whether you just need to build soil, preventing erosion. You know, you can take these mycelial mats, and these mushroom farms are producing hundreds of tons of this material per week, and they can't give it away. And it's right centered oftentimes around population communities of populations that are in sorely of need of these. So I think in integrating these into permaculture systems, integrating these into Christian communities, Buddhist communities, this is an essential piece of the puzzle that is missing. And this essential piece of the puzzle can be a catalyst for a paradigm shifting change for benefiting the future. And they work quickly and they can work now. Okay.
Right. And it's 2100. And
okay.
What do you want to tell those people from given what you know now, obviously?
Okay, I'm speaking to generations way beyond my own lifetime. And I like to say that we tried. Many of us tried. What I would like to tell future generations is to always remain children in your scientific curiosity, and to explore nature to its greatest depths, because we are a part of a natural system. We are children of nature. And in order for us to sustain ourselves into the future, we need to stay in that state of bewilderment, of amazement, of curiosity, of passion, of sensitivity to the health needs of everyone around us. So my path has been the mycelial path, and I know it fairly well. There's so much more that I need to know, and I'm hoping that future generations can pick up the torch and pass it on. So
beautiful. Thank you.